Friends, my lesson this morning is entitled The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Moderns. And I have to acknowledge at the very start, so that none will think me guilty of plagiarism, that I am paraphrasing a book title from 1950 by a profound Jewish theologian. His name was Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heschel. Not only a theologian, but also a civil rights activist, a courageous, in his own day, lonely voice, speaking a religious objection to the war in Vietnam. So he was an activist as well as a theoretician, but also a very fine exponent of Jewish values as they could be understood in a mid-20th century context. So I want to start with that message and reapply it to a 21st century context. So instead of Heschel's title, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, I've been influenced by the feminist revolution of the 1960s and 70s, so I say The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Moderns. Right. I have a number of these slight retranslations, just by the way, in our psalm text for today. Justice fills thy right hand. Right. I have a number of lefties in my congregation. So I offer a modest retranslation, justice fills thy dominant hand. So if you're a lefty, you can still say that and not feel dissed. Now, did anyone see the broadcast of the Steinbeck novel East of Eden, the film version of East of Eden, with James Dean and Raymond Massey? I did not see it last night, but I remember seeing it, and I've read the novel closely. When I think of the forbidding father, I can imagine him as having an old-fashioned Calvinist Sabbath. Don't let me catch you playing cards. And what's that? You're smiling. There's got to be some sinful reason why you're smiling. Something, obviously it's a caricature. But we sometimes think of Sabbath as a time of restriction. Don't be doing this, right? Don't even think about doing that. And honestly, in my Jewish tradition, we have a lot of that too. We actually have not 39 steps, but we have 39 forbidden actions. So don't plow a furrow of a field, don't thresh, don't harvest, don't dye the wool to turn it into cloth, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of don'ts on the Sabbath. But we also have some things you ought to do. And what I want to share with you now is how that structure may be understood not in terms of details, but rather in terms of what is it trying to accomplish, and then what could that say to us. So when I think of the harried contemporary person of our socioeconomic group, broadly speaking, you probably own one or another kind of personal communications device which doubles as a computer. Right? You have one of these, although you probably have a more advanced form of it, right? It's a sign of how ubiquitous this is that I stopped wearing a wristwatch once I. Some of you respond to that too, right? Or as I could say down the block, can I get an amen? I don't think we do that much here, but. Ostensibly, it frees you. Right? You don't have to be at your desk to answer your messages. But you very quickly see what the other side is. Yep. Rabbi, I texted you and I left a voicemail. And I tweeted you, and I Twittered, and I Instagrammed, or whatever else it says. And I haven't heard back from you. And it's been all of 17 minutes. So the cumulative effect of this freeing is that it is more constricting. What's left out is time to think. Well, maybe that other great labor savings device, the personal automobile, would give you time to think. I used to work in New York City, and I would commute in. All the nasty things I didn't do from that commute should suffice to atone for many of my sins and get me into heaven. So I used to listen to WQXR, which was the classical music station of the New York Times. Although I would punch in the news radio in time for the news traffic updates. I needed to know if the Lincoln Tunnel was worse or the George Washington Bridge was worse. But other than that, I would listen to Mozart and Bach and things that soothe the spirit. So nowadays we have hands-free devices that you cannot even say, I couldn't answer you, I was driving. So this is just one little example of what I'm talking about. We could multiply this over and over again. And really, my beef is not with the cell phone. My beef is with the notion that human existence shouldn't really have an alteration of work and refreshment. That's really the problem here. With that in mind, I'd like to remind you of the most counterintuitive story of the Bible. I think it's the most counterintuitive because it's a story that at one level you could say is contradicted by the most cursory empirical evidence. It's an outstanding, extraordinary claim. And it's the very first story in the Bible. It's the claim that God rested on the seventh day. Now we're so used to it because it's a story we've probably all learned it by vacation Bible school or Sunday school. By third grade we know this story, if not sooner. So it's familiar and it's hard baked in. And we think, of course, God made the world in 6 days, God rested on the seventh day. But look up to the heavens, as Isaiah tells us to do. You don't see the sun and the moon and the stars not going in their orbits on the seventh day. Or to be more precise, the earth doesn't stop spinning on its axis on the seventh day. You don't see the grass stop growing on the seventh day. The animals don't just take a 24-hour siesta, unless, of course, it's an anaconda snake which ate on Friday, and then it's not going to do anything till Tuesday anyway. But that's just the luck of the draw. So, in fact, nature does not stop on the seventh day. And yet the story tells us to look to nature and see the pattern of Sabbath baked into it. It's astounding. And it's not only there for literary effect, because it's then quoted as the proof for Sabbath rest in Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. It's institutionalized. Right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Do your work on 6 days, rest on the seventh day, that's a Sabbath unto the Lord. For on 6 days did the Lord God create the heavens and the earth and the seas and all that are within it, and rest on the seventh day, and sanctify that day, and therefore you should rest too. That's an astounding claim. It takes what we might have understood as beautiful poetry, and it makes it law. Just by the way, when the book of Deuteronomy reiterates the Ten Commandments, it doesn't give you that rationale. It gives a different rationale, which in a sense is maybe more social rather than theological. Well, no, it's theological too, but it's more immediately social. It says, you should rest on the seventh day because you should remember that you were slaves in Egypt. A slave doesn't have the ability to rest. Someone else controls his time. Now that you're free, honor that freedom by resting, which is indeed part of what we need to hear today as well. Honor the freedom by resting. Now, all of this notion of the technological invasion of the Sabbath, in fact, is not a 21st century innovation. Rabbi Heschel wrote about it in 1950. Before Rabbi Heschel, a great German Jewish Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, made that his explanation of the Sabbath in the mid-1800s. And maybe the best one-sentence description of this problem that I know was the description given by the great American religious thinker Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist thinker. Emerson said, it's a kind of an epigram: things are in the saddle, they ride mankind. So who's in the saddle? You or your cell phone? That's the issue. The Sabbath reminds us that we can get back in the saddle, figuratively speaking, by unplugging. So what I'd like us to think about is the Sabbath not so much as a time when, oh, you mustn't play cards, or oh, you mustn't garden in the garden, or whatever the specific concretization, which varies from tradition to tradition. I'd like you to think of the Sabbath as an opportunity to regain contact with the well springs of our humanity, because that's really God's gift to us. So that's the general thesis that I'm propounding today, and I'd like to continue to explore it by means of reading with you the first chapter of this very, very beautiful essay written by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, which he calls The Sabbath, Holiness in Time. And as we go along, I'm going to give you a hypothesis. I have not had the opportunity to prove this. I'm just going to state it. One of these days, I'm going to take a sabbatical and go to the Ratner archives for the study of conservative Judaism and go through the Rabbi Heschel papers and find in his personal correspondence. And I think I can substantiate this. Heschel talks about building a palace in time. And no one spoke that way when he wrote this. My belief is that he wrote this in 1950, only a few years after the atomic bomb had hastened the end of the Second World War, thereby making Einstein's theory of relativity of vital interest not only to the scientific community, but to 150 million Americans. So everyone was talking about Einstein. And Einstein teaches you to think in terms of space-time, the space-time continuum, the 4 dimensions, not the 3 dimensions of space. Personally, I believe that Rabbi Heschel picked up all that buzz and thought theologically, now we have a modern, we have a contemporary nomenclature to explain what Sabbath has always been about. That's where I think his concept, holiness in time, comes from. I might be wrong, but it's a good working hypothesis. So if you would read along with me, please. I'll start at the beginning. I've taken this from an anthology. This is not Heschel's original publication, although these are his words. The anthology is Between God and Man. One of my own principal dissertation advisors, a philosophy professor in New York, Dr. Fritz Rothschild, who is a Heschel specialist. Rothschild created this anthology, and I'll just tell you, Heschel's writing style, he goes around and around and around and around the point, each time illuminating it from a slightly different angle, and the lyricism is lovely. Some philosophers object because he doesn't write in a rigorous way. And Rothschild told me that when he defended his dissertation, his professor at Columbia University, a great professor of intellectual history named John Herman Randall. I don't know if you ever heard that name. John Herman Randall always had a cigar in his mouth. And at the end of the dissertation defense, Randall takes the cigar out of his mouth and says, "Rothschild, you have accomplished what Almighty God could not do. You have turned Heschel into a systematic thinker." Anyway, we don't need to explore the entire system. I think that Heschel is a systematic thinker, but that doesn't mean he expressed himself systematically. But we're going to look at only one of his points now, the point about the Sabbath, which he calls holiness in time. So he begins, technical civilization, which is meaning where we are. Technical civilization is man's conquest of space. It is a triumph frequently achieved by sacrificing an essential ingredient of existence, namely time. In technical civilization, we expend time to gain space. To enhance our power in the world of space is our main objective. Yet to have more does not mean to be more. The power we attain in the world of space terminates abruptly at the borderline of time. But time is the heart of existence. I think you can already feel that there's a certain atmosphere that he's creating in these words. He's using a vocabulary that was probably, as I mentioned before, quite familiar in 1950, but he's expressing a critique of the American society that he was observing. It's good for us to remember that Heschel was an immigrant in America. He was born in Poland. He was born to a mystical Hasidic Jewish family, but their lack of a desire to have contact with the rigorous critical tradition of Western thought made him leave them behind. He went to Berlin, where he took a PhD writing his dissertation on Moses Maimonides, the thought of Maimonides. And then he was expelled from Germany when the Nazis came to power, because one of their pre-final solution steps was to expel non-German Jews from Germany. So he was expelled back to Poland. He was desperately looking for a place to live in safety, because the Polish government thought in the late 1930s to stave off a Nazi invasion by becoming all the more anti-Semitic themselves, so that the Nazis might think of them as a friendly allied state. It obviously didn't work. It also sheds light on the contemporary brouhaha over the Polish law that it's against the law to say that Poland was complicit in the Holocaust. So they were outdoing themselves in anti-Semitic measures before September of 1939. Good to keep this in context. So Heschel was looking for a place of refuge, and in America, the Reformed Jewish Seminary in Cincinnati, the Hebrew Union College, invited him to come as a visiting professor. He came, but the style of religiosity there was it didn't have enough of traditional piety. So he went from there to New York to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was a professor of theology for the rest of his life. I knew him slightly when I was a very little boy. My father, who was a rabbi in New Jersey, invited Rabbi Heschel to come to our congregation and preach sermons on the high holidays. Our congregation was so large back then that we had 2 parallel services on the high holidays. So Rabbi Heschel spoke to what we call the overflow service. Isn't that a sweet word for it? And the one memory I have of Rabbi Heschel is that he took off his suit coat and held it, like a bullfighter. And I was 4 years old, 5. I pretended to be a bull, and I danced and I charged his cape, and then he had me hold it and he charged my cape. So I want you to realize this rigorous thinker is also a very playful man. So Heschel is telling us that we may be in love with the fins on the Oldsmobile. We may really want to have the extra room that we add on to the Cape Cod house that we just bought. Think 1950. Everyone's moved out to Levittown, Long Island. Okay? We've accomplished what Jackie Gleason and the Honeymooners could never accomplish. Right? A one-family home. A grateful nation, grateful to the 11 million U.S. GIs who came back from World War II. 11 million is a large number for a country of 150 million. We created 2 wonderful programs for them, and it's the most important marriage in American social history. It's the marriage of G.I. Bill to Fannie Mae. The marriage of G.I. Bill and Fannie Mae allowed these 11 million veterans to get a higher degree, a college degree often, and to buy a one-family home. So in 1950, the flavor of America is about having more. Have more in your house, have a better house, have a fancier car, and so on and so forth. And that acquisitiveness did not end. A decade from then you wanted to have an air conditioner. And a half a decade after that, you wanted to have a color television, and so on and so forth. And some of the greatest minds in America were going into Madison Avenue to convince you that you could not be happy without having what they want to sell you. And we still have that today. Some of the greatest creativity, and maybe this is a sad commentary on the future of our country, some of our greatest creativity goes into persuading you to buy stuff. Right? Now, Heschel, the immigrant, in America only for a decade, sees what's happening, and he thinks, what profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? Right? That wasn't his nomenclature, but that's what he's saying here. So the Sabbath is designed to help you regain a quality of the spiritual. That's what he's trying to tell us here. Space, in his vocabulary, means a life consumed by a focus on things, acquisitiveness. Now, what's lost when the focus is on things? One of the things that lost is other people. The father, and this is understandable, I'm not trying to give a facile criticism here. The father who's never home for putting the kids to bed because he expresses his love and devotion by working those extra hours to bring home the bacon. Not being a facile criticism, but I work with families. A lot of my work is pastoral. I can tell you that the room full of toys, little boy toys and then big boy toys, don't speak to the heart of the teenage or adult child as much as having been there with the child in a regular way speaks to the heart of the child. So as those popular philosophers, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, were to say about 15 years after Dr. Heschel, money can't buy me love. Money can't buy me love. So the Sabbath reminds us that we need to have people and not things as a regular focus in our life. So for me, an essential part of Sabbath is a family meal. Now, some of us live apart from family. Doesn't mean you can't have a Sabbath. One of the main innovations in my own congregation up on Granby Street is that instead of a little snack, a piece of cake or, we're Jews, a piece of herring, and then you go off, what we now do, we've done this for 20 years, is we give a whole sit-down luncheon to our congregants every Sabbath. And it's got a nice salad bar, and of course, because we're Jewish, it's got tuna fish. You know that is God's gift to the Jewish people. So we have a number of folks in our congregation who are getting on in years. They're almost shut-ins. Or they're shut-ins except that someone brings them to the service. Or this is the one time a week they really can get out. Whatever it is, this is the high point socially for them. We want to make sure that there's ample time and no one is flicking the lights to say you have to leave. I think that that's as important, that fellowship, as the prayers that precede it. And I'll also mention that people whose eyes are on their wristwatch when the service ought to be ending are less worried when they know they're going upstairs and lunch is made for them. that when they think that they have to go home and put the brisket in the oven. Okay? So, word to the wise for fellow clergy, you buy yourself some grace if you give them lunch afterwards. So a Sabbath meal. Now in Judaism, the big Sabbath meal is at the inauguration of the Sabbath, which is Friday night. A number of people come to me each year because they're interested in deepening their religious experience. Some of them are Jewish and want to live Jewishly more intensely. Some of them have no religious background and want to be religious in the Jewish key. That's the key they want to sing their song to God in. Some of them had an unsatisfactory experience in one or more than one religion, and they've found their way to me. The very first practical bit of piety that I instruct them in is this inauguration of the Sabbath. So picture the scene. It has to be modified based on your personal circumstances. You have the parents, if there's more than one, they make it a point to be home. Whatever business meetings you might have don't take place on Friday night. It's a candlelit dinner. Traditionally, it's the woman of the household. It could be the woman or the man, but traditionally, it's the woman. She lights the candles. A very interesting gesture. I remember this from a little child. She covers her eyes, or some households, they cover the flame of the candles. The reason for that is that in Judaism, when we say a prayer of enjoyment, you break bread. Right? Before you eat the bread, you say the prayer, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, you who have brought forth bread from the ground." You take a glass of wine. Before you drink it, you say, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine." In each case, you say the blessing before the enjoyment. In this instance, if we were to say the blessing, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, you've made us holy by giving us commandments, and you've commanded us to kindle Sabbath lights." If we said those words, it would be the Sabbath. And then, following the restrictions of our tradition, we wouldn't be able to strike the match. Oops. So we light the flame first. It could be a wax candle. That's the European Jewish tradition, which many of us are heir to. It could be an oil lamp, the wick in the reservoir, which is a Mediterranean tradition, and which is making a very nice comeback, by the way. So we light the flame first, but that's not the order that we're supposed to do for the blessing. So we cover the flame. I didn't see it. What flame? Did you see a flame? Nonetheless, there's a kind of a little magical moment there. It's like, close your eyes, make a wish. Don't blow out these candles, but close your eyes, make a wish. And the wish is, may we have a day of blessing. I remember one of my first memories as being a little boy, about as old as I was when I was playing bullfight with Dr. Heschel, and standing next to my mother every Friday when she would have her eyes covered. And I knew that when she finished lighting the candles, she'd scoop me up and give me a kiss. So that's how a 5-year-old begins to love the Sabbath. Think of what we learned from Piaget. Little children think concretely. Only later do they begin to think abstractly. Love the Sabbath is loving an abstraction. Loving getting hugged and kissed by mommy is concrete. So that's how the Sabbath would start. And similarly, when I would go to the Bronx on weekends for Sabbath with my grandparents. But here, my grandparents did something else which adds the social dimension I want you to realize. The laws, which can be technical, said you shouldn't be carrying money on the Sabbath day. You shouldn't be spending money, so you shouldn't be carrying money, because what are you going to carry it for if you're not going to spend it, right? You'd be tempted. Lead us not into temptation, right? So my grandfather would come home. He used to take the D train, for those of you who know the subways in New York, to Jerome Avenue. He'd walk up to the house, take the elevator up to the 6th floor. We'd all be waiting for him. and my grandmother would have the Sabbath table prepared. She hadn't yet lit the candles, she was about to. He took all the change out of his pocket and put it into a blue and white charity box, which was hanging on a hook on the wall in the kitchen nook. So the Sabbath began, or the work week ended, by giving charity. What a nice thought. So here you have the ceremonial, technical requirement of carry no money on the Sabbath merged with the ethical mandate, let me help those who are less fortunate. It so happened that there were many different charity boxes in my grandparents' house. They were helping lots and lots of different recipients. This particular box was a blue and white box. It had the map of the Mediterranean coastline of Israel and the Jordan River on it, and this was the Jewish National Fund. These pennies and nickels, which were put into the boxes on Friday afternoon just before the Sabbath, were used to buy agriculturally wretched swampland, because that's the only thing that was for sale. And the Zionist pioneers would break their backs draining those swamps. And that's how they turned Israel into a blooming garden again. So my grandfather Robert and my grandmother Gittel were pioneers in spirit that way as well. So here, in this one moment, we have fidelity to a ceremonial law, we have ethical concern, and we have participation in a national enterprise. All in that one gesture. And if that's not good enough, you add, teach your children well. Teach your children to live by values. So when I think Sabbath, it's really so much more than do this and don't do that. Now, let's go back to the Ten Commandments. I want to show you how the rabbis deal with a very interesting variation in the text. Exodus chapter 20. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Deuteronomy chapter 5. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So what did God say? Did God say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? Did God say, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy? Is one of the two biblical quotations in error? What a horrible thought. Right? Well, the classic rabbinic statement here is that God's speech is not human speech. You and I can only say one word at a time. If we try to say two words simultaneously, it'll be garbled, right? What'll come out will be nonsense. But God could say shamor and zachor b'dibur echad. God could say observe and remember in one utterance, and we clearly heard both. It was a miracle. It's a miracle. That's the rabbinic understanding. But that doesn't exhaust what the rabbis did with this variation. Because the rabbis were a lawyerly bunch. They read the Bible following the legal principle of parsimony. If you have two words in a text where you could have had one, that second word shouldn't be construed as only having rhetorical force. It should be teaching you something. So if you already have the words, observe the Sabbath day, then what else is being taught by the words, remember the Sabbath day? So the rabbinic approach to this is to say, observe is all those requirements. Don't build a fire, don't do this, don't do that. Remember is the positives. The positives. Remember to celebrate the Sabbath. Celebrate the Sabbath when you come into the Sabbath. Celebrate the Sabbath just before you end the Sabbath. And this leads to a very beautiful notion of Sabbath, which in Hebrew is called oneg Shabbat. The word oneg means delight. The delight of the Sabbath. Sabbath delight. It comes from a quotation in Isaiah chapter 58. You folks who are worried that you're not prospering, maybe you should try resting on the Sabbath. It might improve the whole quality of your lives. And then you will call the Sabbath a delight. So that expression, Sabbath delight, refers to the enjoyment of the Sabbath. Now, you don't have to take out a second mortgage in order to enjoy the Sabbath. But there is a tradition of saving the best that you're capable of for the Sabbath table. Again, I'll go back to my upbringing. We were comfortable. We weren't living lavishly, but we were living comfortably. Somehow there was always money for books. I remember that. There was always money to buy a new book. But I do remember that the most elaborate meal of the week was the Sabbath meal. And that my father took me with him on his errands on Friday afternoon. And we went to, this was in Paterson, New Jersey, we went to a place called the East Side Bakery, where Sam Friedman, the kosher baker, would give my father a baker's dozen of jelly donuts. Because my father would have Sam cut the 13th one in half and give half to me and eat half on the way home. And then he took his wonderfully pressed pocket square out of his breast pocket of his black pinstripe suit, and he wiped away all the incriminating evidence, first from my mouth and then from his, so that my mother, rest her soul, would not suspect that my father had spoiled my appetite for dinner. And in truth, he didn't spoil my appetite for dinner. I chowed down just fine. So, again, my father was teaching me, at age 7 or 8 or 9, about the Sabbath is a delight. We didn't do this on a Monday, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, or a Thursday. We didn't do that. So, delight. Now, the next story I have to tell you is a little bit PG. So I look around, I say, I think we're all appropriate for this. In rabbinic teaching, the Sabbath is a time for married couples to renew their conjugal intimacy. It's spoken about frankly. There's no sense of taboo of this in the Bible, in rabbinics. So that too is Sabbath delight. I remember I was teaching about the Sabbath at Virginia Wesleyan College. And I remember well because there was one young woman who sat in the front and there was one young fellow sat right next to her. He was a newlywed. She had just come from Israel. And so after every 5 or 6 minutes of lecture, I would stop and give her 30 seconds or 45 seconds of a précis of what I just said in Hebrew so that she would be able to keep up with the lecture. And he thought that I was telling her trade secrets. So he would tell her that, and they had a lot of very good banter. His name was David, her name was Anat. So, and David, you must know, David was a newlywed at the time of this class, which is about 15 years ago. So I get to the talk about the Sabbath, and I talk about the wonderful Friday night meal. And then I talk about the conjugal tradition. And this guy throws his pencil up in the air, and he says, I love this religion. It's all food and sex. How do I sign up? It's not all food and sex. But the best part of the story is that the young Israeli woman turns to him and says, what are you talking about? You're a newlywed. So, Sabbath delight. I want to also urge you to translate everything that I'm saying from the strictures of the Jewish tradition with its own restriction to the norms of your own faith traditions. Because there are certain things that we don't eat that you eat, and so on and so forth. My students at ODU and my students at Wesleyan are always amazed that I tell them I don't miss the taste of ham. I don't know what it's like, I don't miss it. But I will tell you a famous Jewish rabbi joke about ham, because you're going to like this. There's a Yiddish expression I'll say it in Yiddish. I don't know if anyone here speaks Yiddish. As mir ist chazer es soll rinnen von Moel. If you're going to eat pork, it should be running from your beard. In other words, or I like to translate it, if you're going to eat non-kosher, go whole hog. So the story is about a rabbi who is wrestling and wrestling with the craving for the taste of pork. He's never had it. He can't imagine ending the one short life that we have, finishing our walk through this vale of tears, and never having tasted pork. And the more he tries to put out of his mind, it's like they say that Dostoevsky once tormented his brother by saying to him, now don't think about a white bear. So you know that that's all the guy thought about, right? So the rabbi couldn't get it out of his mind. Finally, he decided, okay, he'll do it once. So he finds a restaurant on the other side of the tracks, goes to the back of the restaurant, unscrews the light bulb from the sconce, and he figures, okay, whole hog. He orders roast suckling pig. We know how it comes out like that. So the waiter is bringing out, Arnold on the on the platter with the apple, right? And the rabbi's Jewish luck. Into the restaurant at that precise moment walk all of the lay officers of his congregation. The president, the vice president, the treasurer, the secretary, everybody. Here goes his career. The next sentence out of his mouth is going to either save his career or not. He has a flash of inspiration. He says, America, it's such a golden land. I ordered a baked apple and look how they serve it. So the point is that, every tradition has its own strictures and its own permissions that are not common to other traditions. And I recognize that. So I'm urging you to take these words and do the necessary translation so that they work within the Christian concept. Also, I want to urge you to be as creative as you need to be. And this will be the closing point I want to make because I want to have time for questions and answers. Do you remember there was a popular song, maybe circa 1960, but not on Sunday? Oh, you can kiss me on a Monday, a Tuesday? Never on a Sunday. Okay, that's it. So my older son now, who's just finished his PhD training, he's a professor of linguistics now. When he was about 7 or 8, he said, why don't we scribble with crayons on the Sabbath? We don't do that. It's one of the things we don't do. So he loved music, so I made up a song for him. I said, remember, our Sabbath is Saturday. Okay? Oh, you can scribble on a Sunday, a Monday, a Tuesday, that's all right with me. Oh, you can scribble on a Wednesday, a Thursday, a Friday, I'm happy as can be. But not on Shabbat, it's my day of rest. Of all the days of the week, I like Shabbat the best. Anyway, this kid has a cataloging mind. So he asked me to go through all the other 38 laws that you... So I had to sing the song 39 times. So the point of this little vignette is not just to share wonderful memories of childhood. That's always fun. The point is to show that when we teach our children to walk in the ways of the Lord, we have to have one eye on the tradition that we are transmitting and one eye on the realities of the world that we're commending it to. Because a tradition which is not at all translated into a contemporary life will fail to engage people who are defined generationally. It's a challenge for all of our congregations. I don't know if you have anxious deliberations in your church councils about what do we need to do differently to reach out to millennials. Perhaps you have such conversations. I know very few churches that don't have such conversations, right? So, and I don't know an answer better than you know an answer, but I do know that religion speaks of timeless truths. Timeless and timely have to be brought into correlation. That's our task. And Sabbath is a wonderful way to do that and a wonderful place to begin. Thank you very much.